Hello, and welcome to another vlog. I hope everyone has had a chance to watch some of the Olympics. I certainly have been watching a lot of it. Anyway, this week's theme is depression. Tune in on Thursday if you want to learn more about that, and don't forget to subscribe. Today there's quite a few things I want to talk about. First, I have a bit of an announcement, and then I want to debunk some common myths about depression. I want to talk about some of the different types of depression, and I want to talk about some of the treatments for depression. So there's a lot of material to cover today. So let's jump right into it. You may remember me talking about this on some of my previous vlogs about a new accessibility legislation that the government of Nova Scotia has implemented in hopes of making the province of Nova Scotia fully accessible by the year 2030. Now, as part of that legislation, the Nova Scotia government has decided to put together an accessibility advisory committee to advise them on how to best go about implementing this legislation so that they can reach their goal of making the province fully accessible by 2030. And I received word late last week that I am one of the people who has been chosen to sit on that committee and advise the government on this matter. So I just thought that was something that I'd like to share with you because I talk a lot about the advocacy work that I do on this series, and this is a good way to continue that. And it's something that I'm very happy about. I'm glad that the Nova Scotia government is trying to make accessibility a priority, and I'm optimistic about the direction that this is going to go. So I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's great news, and I'm certainly happy about it, mainly because I think it's going to help improve the accessibility situation here in Nova Scotia. So that brings me to the next thing that I want to talk about today, the main thing, which is some common myths about depression. I know depression is a mental illness that is oftentimes very misunderstood. So I've chosen 3 big myths, common myths about depression that I want to debunk. So the first myth is that depression is not a real illness. A lot of people mistake depression with just being sad. But the fact is, depression is a real illness, and there's a lot more to it than just being sad. We know that depression is a real illness because people with depression have different brain chemistry than people who do not have depression. We know that their brains are wired differently. We don't fully understand how that causes depression, but we do know that that is the way things are. Depression can affect every part of the body and every aspect of someone's life. And of course, it does sometimes lead to suicide. So it is a very serious condition and very real. The next myth is that people with depression can snap out of it. People often think that depression is just a sign of weakness and that it's caused because someone wallows in their own sadness or self-pity. Now, this couldn't be far from the truth. The fact is, depression oftentimes requires treatment in order for people with depression to get better. There's this common myth that exercise can cure depression. Now, it is true that exercise can help some people with depression manage some of their symptoms, but it doesn't replace other forms of treatment. In other words, no, exercise cannot cure depression. In order for someone who has depression to actually get better, they can't just will themselves better. They actually need to get proper treatment. We know that medication such as antidepressants work to help manage depression, and sometimes there is no other option. And that brings me to the third myth, which is that depression affects everyone the same way. This is a very harmful misconception because it just adds to the stigma that people with mental illness should look and behave a certain way. The fact is, there are many different symptoms of depression, and not everybody with depression shows all of those symptoms. Sometimes you don't even know that someone's depressed. people can sometimes hide their depression. It is a very complicated condition. So the fact is, it does affect everyone differently. So those are the three biggest myths about depression that I personally have noticed that I wanted to debunk. And that takes me to the third thing that I want to talk about today, which is the different types of depression. So as you'll see in the video on Thursday, there's 5 main types of depression, and I'm going to talk about those. There's other types of depression too, but I'm talking about these 5 types specifically. So the first type is called persistent depressive disorder, or dysthmia. And this is a form of depression that lasts usually 2 years or more, and it fluctuates in severity. It's one of the more common forms of depression. The next type is what's called perinatal depression, which specifically affects women usually after they give birth. And although it only typically lasts about 2 weeks, it can be very serious. The third kind is called psychotic depression. This is a form of depression that's accompanied by psychosis. So when they say psychosis, they're specifically talking about delusions and hallucinations. The fourth type is seasonal affective disorder. Now, we talked about this in previous episodes. Seasonal affective disorder is a form of depression that's associated with the changing of the seasons, and it's especially common during the winter months, but it can also be present during the summer months. And then finally, there's bipolar disorder. And this is considered a form of, it's considered a depressive disorder. Now, bipolar disorder, which we'll be talking about in later episodes, is a mental illness that's characterized by periodic changes in mood. So people with bipolar disorder typically experience extreme highs, known as mania, and then extreme lows, known as depression. And that's why it is considered a depression disorder. But it's also a separate mental illness as well, and we'll talk about that in future episodes. This brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about today, which is the different types of treatment for depression. Specifically, I want to talk about one treatment in particular, which is called Electroconvulsive Therapy, or ECT. Now, if you've ever watched the show Stranger Things, you'll know there's a scene in season 2 where one of the characters undergoes electroshock therapy. And the reason I bring that up is because electroshock therapy of the past and modern-day electroconvulsive therapy are very, very different. Side note, if you have not seen Stranger Things, I recommend that you go watch it because it is a very good show. There are some very noticeable differences between electroshock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, typically targets specific parts of the brain that are associated with depression. They'll send a small electrical current through that part of the brain, which causes a controlled seizure. But this doesn't usually lead to a lot of convulsions because the patients are almost always sedated, which reduces the risk of injury and other serious complications that would result in. Now, they're not 100% sure how ECT works, but they do know that it does help to manage the symptoms of depression, oftentimes better than antidepressants. That being said, they typically use ECT as more of a last resort if counseling and medication aren't working as effectively as they should. And then they'll use ECT to try and treat it. Treatments typically happen about 3 times a week, and they only last about 10 minutes or so. But it does help with managing the condition. Now, like most patients with depression, a lot of patients who get ECT receive a combination of different treatments. That is typically the best way to manage depression. And there are risks associated with ECT, just like there are with any treatment. But before they prescribe the treatment, they're going to first take a look at your complete medical history and also do a medical exam to see if the treatment's right for you and to make sure that it is safe. They don't use the treatment usually on people with underlying conditions because that typically increases the risk of complications. This is especially true for things like heart conditions and other similar health issues like that. So if they don't think that electroconvulsive therapy is safe because someone has an underlying condition, or maybe there's another reason that they don't think it's safe, they're not going to use it. And obviously they're only going to use it if they know that it's going to help this person. And there are other ways to manage the risks. There's preparations that the patient will go through before they receive the treatment. And so the main reason why I want to talk about that today is because I think this is a treatment that a lot of people don't really understand, and it's not like it is portrayed in the movies and TV shows. That's not what ECT is like. It's very different from how people perceive it. It's definitely different from how I perceived it, and it's also a very effective and usually safe treatment. So that's all the things that I wanted to talk about today. I hope you found it as interesting and as informative as I have. Tune into Thursday's video if you want to learn more, and definitely subscribe if you want to see that video. Also, be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.